So, for the final panel, there's no time like the present to talk about the future again, but this time we're talking about long-term, and it's my pleasure to introduce Michna Katutsi, Head of Research at Energy Policy Group, for panel number 3.
I mean, that wasn't necessary, but thank you very much. Thanks, Luciana. What a morning it has been, right? I mean, the discussions we've had, in a way, I was afraid that we're having a 10-year anniversary event. We have people from different sectors discussing different time periods, that we wouldn't be focused, that we wouldn't have discussions of substance. But I was contradicted, yeah? So thank you very much for everyone who's taking the floor before. Fantastic conversations on grids, prices, the future of gas, on what Europe's role in the world is, what international trade policy means for the ability we have to deliver on the transition. I also want to thank everyone for still sticking around. I know it's been quite an intense round of debates. And also for those people that are online, I've checked right before, there's still more than 100 people with us live, so thanks to those people as well. All right, the final panel, the future of the European economy in 2035 and beyond. There was a lot of tensions about investments, assets, stranded assets. We're left with the fun part, yeah? We're left with what happens after 2035, at a period in which we will have already known to an extent whether we've managed to implement on the targets that we've already set. We'll have questions of whether have we been able to electrify at the pace at which we are required. Are we on track for reducing fossil fuel demand to the extent to which we need for reaching our targets? What does it mean when the world moves in different ways than perhaps Europe does? We speak more and more about competitiveness, maybe a bit less about climate policy, but this sort of interaction is also interesting to understand going forward what will happen. All right, I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to invite the panelists for today. So we have with us Alexandra Bocșe, who's a state advisor for the Romanian presidential administration. We have Christian Egenhofer, who's a senior research fellow at CEPS and a research senior associate at the European University Institute. We have Jozsef Feiler, who's a director for Southeast Europe at the European Climate Foundation. And last but not least, we have Milan Elkerbout, who's an international climate policy fellow at the Resources for the Future from the US. All right, I am lucky not only because we're left with the fun conversation, I think, but also because it's a conversation among friends, and very much looking forward to the discussions. The way I think we will go about it is that I will give a topic to each of you to reflect a bit upon for a few minutes. I will follow up with a question, and then we'll try to have a bit of a conversation. We'll try to move from Romania outwards, yeah. So to try to slowly expand and see what the international perspective can be for this. And I would like to start with you, Alexandra. To speak, we've spoken quite a lot recently about Romania's evolving governance framework, about the fact that we've set some ambitious targets, but are we able to deliver them? Do we have the mechanisms in place that are good for this? What are the main barriers going forward? So please.
Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you so much for organizing this particular panel. And I do realize actually that the topic that we pre-discussed in preparing this panel is more towards governance rather than the economy, but definitely I'm happy also to contribute in the second part of the panel also on the economic thinking behind the green transition. So in terms of governance in Romania, I think we have actually, when it comes to the green transition and climate change, I think we have made some progress. In recent years, we have seen the development of certain institutional structures that are more targeted on the field of climate change. We started in 2020 with the presidential administration, where President Iohannis decided to set up a department on climate and sustainability. And then, of course, at the level of the government, there was a need to provide us with partners for our conversation on climate. What we did realize from the initial interaction between the Department of Climate and Sustainability and the government was that we were lacking proper coordination structures. So formally, climate change was at that point the responsibility of the Ministry of Environment, and issues related to the green transition were the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy. But the green transition and climate change is a topic that needs to go beyond the attention of two ministries. So with the help of the presidential administration and with the support of the President of Romania, at the level at the Chancellery of the Prime Minister and the General Secretariat of the Government, a structure was built, the Interministerial Committee on Climate Change. And this is a structure that brings together regularly both the political level and both the technical level. And this is important because, of course, when it comes to climate action, the green transition, we need to have the technical elements, we need to have the data. But there also needs to be political backup because I guess we can agree that very ambitious targets when it comes to reducing emissions need to have that kind of political backup and need to be embraced basically by the government. So I would say that in this structure of coordination, certain goals have been achieved. Strategies like the long-term strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions were discussed. The updating of the National Energy and Climate Plan, which is now taking place, is being discussed. And all in all, certain priorities that were set up for 2020 at the governmental level were pushed and were accomplished. And I would mention among those the emission of Eurobonds, sovereign bonds by Romania earlier this year. In addition, on the diplomatic side, I want to mention also the network of green embassies. Basically, this is a loose structure that was set up by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order to stimulate more the involvement of Romania in international climate and green diplomacy. And of course, it's work in progress, but so far, I think it has helped us with becoming a bit more present in international climate diplomacy. So we do have an evolving governance and institutional framework, but of course, I think we are not completed with the work there. And we have discussed, Mihnea, and I have discussed in certain occasions with several of you in this room, the fact that sometimes we do feel at the level of the state, the level of the government, that we are lacking expertise on many issues that are very relevant for the green transition. So the further development of an expert structure at the center of the government, maybe in a dedicated agency, is something that we need to work at. Because of course, although we do engage with consultants, with experts in developing our strategies, the long-term strategy, the adaptation strategy, there is a need to have experts in the government that will be able to have the conversation with the consultants, with the experts, that would be able to maybe give feedback, and that would be able also to kind of present the position of the Romanian government in those conversations. Now we are having a conversation at the technical level and political level between the presidential administration and the government of Romania on the EU 2040 target. And as you know, basically the impact assessment for this target that was communicated by the Commission earlier this year, the impact study is like hundreds of pages of technical data that needs to be assessed from a technical point of view and also from a political point of view, and this is posing, certain challenges. We have started the process, but it's not completed. So these are the kind of situations where we feel that we need basically more technical expertise and that we would need a dedicated structure that would be able to provide the public institutions in Romania with this expertise. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you walking us a bit through what's been happening in terms of the governance framework, because I must confess, I've been at DPG for 5 years and the transformation has been immense since I got here. It feels like the topic is being taken a bit more seriously and that expertise is slow to build. I think we've explored together and with others also some ideas about how this can be taken further. This includes the introduction of an independent scientific advisory body, perhaps hopefully in a framework climate law that Romania should have at some point. But you mentioned that at the end of the day, okay, there's the problem of administrative capacity. We set the targets, sure, but without political backup, this doesn't mean much. And something that I wanted to get at is, I feel like climate has never taken center stage in Romanian politics yet. I always look at the polls. We've heard from Matthias earlier about some figures as well, whether there is or not a green backlash. But I feel like the Romanian citizens are always more ambitious and open to change than their politicians. However, we are seeing trends and increasing headwinds that signal potential backlash against green measures in Romania as well. Do you think we're prepared? Do we have the right capacity, institutions, expertise to deal with such backlash?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned this because, as you may know, and as you also did, I did live in the United Kingdom for a long time before returning to Romania. And the debate on climate was definitely more of a central issue in the public domain and in the political domain in the UK. And in Romania, of course, climate change has started to be part of the public agenda and the media agenda relatively recently. But at the same time, I have seen, and in my opinion, we have seen less elements of climate denial, climate change denial in Romania. If we look at different surveys, we do see that Romanians at different ages do state when asked that climate change is real, that climate change is a challenge. Especially among younger demographics, we see also a lot of willingness to act. And I would say in the mainstream political parties, climate denial is not part of the political discourse. And there is an agreement that is happening and that measures need to be taken. Now, when it comes to the measures, the cost of those measures here is where the conversation becomes more complex. And I would say also the level of the public opinion. In the surveys that have been conducted, people, 80–90% are basically saying climate change is a problem, it's real, it's a major threat. But when it comes to their action, it's not clear if they have an idea how they could actually contribute to reducing emissions. And when we ask them about the costs and how much they would be willing to pay for to be able actually to reduce emissions, that's where we see actually less support and less willingness. But I think it's also important to have certain policies, as was mentioned here by Lee. It's not enough just to have conversations. It's not enough just for politicians to speak about climate change being real. We do need to have policies. And I think education is also very important, and that's why at the level of the presidential administration we have supported climate change education. We do have a national strategy on climate change education. At pre-university level, we have something that we call the Green Week, where children are socialized with environmental and climate values, and we know that they are taking those values also in their families. But education is not only about informing people. Education needs to be also about making them a partner to the government in implementing policies. So that's what we were hoping to achieve. To allow people to understand different processes and for them to make sense certain policies that we are proposing. And I will also mention that in Romania, we have already proposed certain policies that are helping reducing emissions and that also are very popular with people. For instance, rooftop solar PV on houses supported through the Environmental Fund. We also have programs for energy efficiency in schools, and that's how we actually get in certain communities by intervening in the schools that are at the center of the communities. But we also have to use future opportunities, like the Social Climate Fund, that will help us reach the most vulnerable and bring them in the green transition, make them our partners in the green transition, because as you know, the Social Climate Fund is meant basically for interventions at the individual and small enterprise level.
A lot to unpack from the very many things that you mentioned there. But I think it was very interesting that you highlighted this tension between the openness of people to understanding the issue of climate change, but at the same time when it comes to costs, people become more reluctant, and that's something we heard about earlier as well. Who's going to pay for it? You mentioned ETS2, the Social Climate Fund. I think something we can learn from the energy crisis and from the success that Romania now has with prosumers and rooftop PVs is that price signals matter. And we now have a framework under the emissions trading scheme that will price in the emissions from almost the entire economy. We'll get to that in a second, but you mentioned also the impact assessment for 2040, the 400 pages plus document. But one key takeaway from that is that the power sector in Europe needs to become nearly fossil-free by 2040. And with that, I wanted to turn to Jozsef, who has been watching over the transition in the energy sector in Southeast Europe for quite some time. And I'm curious about your perspective on whether we can deliver on such targets. What are the dynamics in different countries? How do they differ? Does Romania stand out in any particular way?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. The question is not easy, obviously, but this is what we like. If you would read public policy textbooks, then power sector is an easy one. It's a low-hanging fruit, practically, to change. All the other sectors are much more difficult. So I would say that even with this very easy low-hanging fruit, we have a lot of challenges. In the past decade, we saw the transformation starting in the region. And I mean, just to be a spoiler, I think by 2040 we can do it. But let's have a couple of points which are challenging for us and why it is not so straightforward. Probably the first one I would like to highlight, that the future what we are looking for is not as the past 10 years. We are living in the world of polycrisis, so there are plenty of challenges. Security is one, so we need to look into a different kind of perspective. For example, when you are looking into nuclear power, we learned that it's not just peaceful application of nuclear power, it's a risk. Security risk can be there from the war we see. So I remember when we started to discuss climate negotiations 20 years ago, there was also the small modular reactor game coming up, and then people have just been saying two words, non-proliferation, and that was the end of it. So it might come back to that as well. The second challenge what I would like to raise is the timeline for decarbonization. We had a timeline that 2050 is for the decarbonization of the whole economies and 2040 for the power sector. It was, according to the IPCC law, what we had, but what we see now that climate change is in all likelihood accelerating. So we might not have the timeline what we envisioned, which would mean that we need to accelerate the decarbonization process. It's not yet in the policy domain, but it's coming. The third one, which is kind of region-specific challenge, is that if we don't do the transition equally with Western Europe, it might be that there will be a new type of poverty emerging in the region. I call it carbon poverty. So those who cannot afford the transition will have much more expenses later on, because everything which is not modernized is more expensive because of the carbon cost of everything. And then what we heard already several times, the last challenge is the backlash. Backlash on various policies and on the transition. So all of these are there challenging us, but still I think Romania specifically can do the transition. And probably more than the other countries because of the situation of the power sector. But in our view, it's not like what we heard earlier. We see that gas might be going out by 2030s, or early part of 2030s. Coal is going to be dead in the whole region, pretty much. And it includes the Western Balkans by 2030. And what we see that hydrogen will be way too expensive to use. And what we see as a potential for Romania to bring in, it's not Neptune Deep with the hydrogen-ready pipeline. It's the wind potential. I mean, the whole region will have a lot of solar. And then that's the thing. The offshore wind is a cutting edge. And I stop here, although there is much more.
I will get back to some of the things you said because I think they're great segues to the interventions of the other panelists as well. But I think you paint the right picture that we in Romania like to complain, like everyone in the Balkans, you know? So it's always the most difficult, it's always the hardest. And at the same time, there's this conflicting narrative that we have the lowest carbon emissions per capita, so others should be more. Well, if you have the lowest carbon emissions per capita, that means you have less to decarbonize, yes? So in a way, it's part of your job is already done. What I wanted to ask you is that we've heard this back and forth in the morning about gas and the role of it, and we've spoken about the power sector, and we are seeing large-scale investments currently being made. Do you think there's a risk of lock-in? Not just here, but around the area? Because also it feels like we're planning only within national borders. We don't look too much at what the neighbors are doing. We're not integrating enough about what's actually necessary, both for the country and for the region.
I think the numbers are saying that gas investments are going to be locked in, and they will not bring the return. So it's not, you know, a passion or a belief. It's just the numbers. If you look at the alternatives and how they are going, the whole game is changing very fast, obviously. So probably if I would be sitting here like 3 years ago, I would be way more careful about it. But I think gas is not a transition fuel, not even in the region.
You also mentioned about the carbon poverty, as you called it, which are these consumers that will struggle to finance the transition to cleaner energy sources for their transport, for their heating, and so on. And Alexandra, you mentioned the Social Climate Fund a bit earlier as well. And this is something that I wanted to ask you a bit about, because I know you've been working on a white paper for the Social Climate Plan of Romania. And I wanted to link it here a bit because I fear that an instinct that Romanian policymakers will have when it comes to the Social Climate Fund will be to force price controls for direct income support and try to basically shield consumers as much as possible from the exposure to the carbon price. Meanwhile, the Social Climate Fund and the associated plan should be more about helping precisely those people that Jozsef spoke about, which even if they get a carbon price signal, they don't have the means to actually transition away. So how can we make sure that Romania's plan is fit for purpose in this regard?
So yes, you did mention a white paper. So what's happening right now in terms of cooperation at the European level, there is an expert group set by the European Commission where we do share between different member states concerns. And one of the challenges that we see at the European level and we face also in our international discussions is basically targeting those that are more vulnerable. Because indeed, and then at this point there are conversations about what vulnerability means for households, for heating and cooling. What does vulnerability mean for transport, and what are the best way to intervene, right? Because simply giving vouchers for electric vehicles will probably not do for vulnerable consumers that are not even close to purchasing an electric vehicle. And of course, what does vulnerability mean for micro enterprises? So that's where we are right now. I mean, the points that you mentioned will be taken into consideration in finalizing the white paper. The purpose of the white paper is somehow, it's a proof of the involvement of the presidential administration, trying somehow to set certain directions for the climate, the social climate plan that will be drafted, finalized, and submitted to the European Commission by June next year, by June 2025.
All right. I want to now move to you, Christian, because initially I wanted to first speak on industry, but we'll get to that because Jozsef has already mentioned the Western Balkans, the fact that they will move out of coal eventually. And this is something that you have been focusing on for a while, and you've been exploring ideas about how to help the region move away from its very high dependence on very old assets for which they have very little resources to actually replace them with. So,
yeah, we have ideas, you know, whether they materialize is another story. But let me just maybe add a point or two before. I've been now 20 or 30 times here in Romania the last 15, 20 years, and this is the first time that you are in Schengen, you know, and it's really makes a difference. I think we should congratulate ourselves. It was a great pleasure. I skip the praise, you know, but let me second the minister. He said everything about EPG, and I couldn't express it much better. Let me also, and that's my last point before I answer your question, or try to, get back to the point from the second panel where we had intensive discussions about people complaining what comes from Brussels. I think there is a 90% chance that your government agreed to the things that come from Brussels. Just perhaps a good point for reflection. Now, on the Western Balkan, Ukraine is always taken, or very often taken, similarly. And I mean, these are really two very different things. But there is one link which is very important, and that is the Ukrainian, Jozsef may be knowing more, energy sector reform when we go towards low carbon will be benefiting or maybe even requiring the large hydro resources of the Western Balkan. Traditionally, this has been the place. There was a deep integration of Soviet Union, Western Balkan, etc., etc. So there's a link. Now, when you look at the Western Balkan, you know, historically again, when I'm there, people say, yeah, you know, we never did something, we always were imposed by somebody else. Now, the EU is not really very good in imposing in energy transition, despite what a lot of people are saying. So where would the change come from? We all know the situation, very much a little bit like in the 90s in Romania and Bulgaria, you know, a lot of, I mean, you know, corruption and, you know, be careful here, we are streamed, interference from foreign countries, etc., etc. But irrespective of all this, there is one avenue which really could make a difference, and that is power sector, as you mentioned. It's collapsing. It's simply collapsing, and something will need to be done. And the only credible strategy to get this done would be by better integration, by linking it. I mean, it's integrated with the EU market. I mean, but better integrating it, including the ETS, etc., etc. And that could be done, and that would lock the Western Balkan politically into the EU. Because once the sector is integrated. Now, just imagine, we talk about 13 billion investment, more or less. That's all it takes. We talk about 5 gigawatt of capacity. This is 1/4 of the Belgium capacity, is 1% of the EU. It's really small, and they have 30% hydro, so everything is laid up for integration, for sector reform. But it needs political will, it needs a political decision, and hopefully also in this part of the world, there is support for this. And there's more knowledge about what's going on. In Western Europe, it's sort of, yeah, it's difficult, etc., etc. I don't think it's really on the radar screen enough.
Fantastic. No, thanks a lot. And also, I think that this sort of issue of integration is becoming more and more important. I think that now that we have the emissions trading system having been revised and added a carbon border adjustment mechanism on top of that, will create some frictions perhaps with integrating the Western Balkans a bit better, and we need solutions. Integrating them in an ETS is an obvious choice for overcoming this. But also, Romania, I think, to an extent, needs to be a bit more outwards looking. We heard a lot about whether gas is a transitional fuel or not, whether the offshore production will contribute to the development of the Romanian economy or not. I think a question that we need to ask ourselves more often is if we do end up extracting that gas, how can we use it to wean off the Western Balkans off the Russian influence, which I think, in a way, is a contribution that's greater, than any of the claims that are being made about its contribution to the transition. But something that I wanted to ask you, Christian, as well on this is to what initially you wanted to discuss, is that the reform in the power sector is very close to the future of industry in Europe. And we've heard this already a bit about European manufacturing, about the future of it. And I'm just curious about what your views are when it comes to the future of the European industry. What are the main drivers on industrial competitiveness? It's something that we hear very often here in Romania as well, about the need to reindustrialize. But how is this connected to the power sector transition? What are the key drivers that need to be put in place?
Yeah, I mean, I could make it easy and say low carbon electricity plus infrastructure, and then you will end up with a power price which in a way influences your industrial situation. Maybe fertilizers is not a good thing. Maybe it is. The market will decide, etc., etc. But the discussion, the way I see it at the moment is, we see on the one hand, structural change, which we have seen before, coal, textile, other industries, electronics were closing down. But this has, of course, a big implication on the fabric, on the industrial fabric, jobs, growth, skills, etc. You name it, and regional implications, of course. And at the other time, the second thing is the new value chains and supply chains that emerge, and the new technologies. And they all, at the moment, they're all very much outside Europe, and that creates this fear that we are changing or trading one geological dependency, gas, with another geological dependency, critical raw materials, and unfortunately there is no short-term solution to that. But let me make a couple of suggestions how other countries are doing it. And interesting is here really Japan, and we had this discussion, do we need tariffs for Chinese products or not? The Japanese are quite relaxed, and believe me, they're living 3,000 years or longer next to China. They know a little bit of the country. And they said, we need these cheap products. We are happy that the Chinese subsidize their products and send it to us. This makes the energy transition much easier, but there are a couple of technologies we really care about. They don't care about solar panels. They don't care about first-generation EVs. They see there is really no chance to catch up, but the second-generation EVs, electrical vehicles, etc., etc. And they have identified, 18 technologies, not sectors. We are doing sectors. We're covering everything. We want to protect all the industry. They have identified specific technologies where they think they're cutting edge and they will not be outcompeted. And that, I think, is a very, very good way that we are thinking about the technologies where we are really good. There's a lot of biotech in Europe. There's a lot of tech companies which we don't know, but maybe we're spending too much effort and money on industries where we are mediocre, also giving the energy prices, massive primary steel making in Europe will be difficult, fertilizers will be difficult, etc., etc. Now, that's probably not very good news, but there is one other point of we can maybe learn a bit from Japan, and that's the last one I'm ending. There is this EU-Japan or EU-Japan-US cooperation climate partnership, and they look into supply chains, into how to have secure, resilient, the term is resilient and sustainable supply chains. So work out something, not with trade policy instruments, but constructive, creating partnerships, etc., etc. And maybe the last point, we speak a lot about Africa. And when you speak with the Africans or you listen to the Africans, they say, look, the Europeans are great in talking, but when the Chinese come, actually when they leave, we have a road, and when the Europeans leave, we have a plan.
Yes, indeed, it's quite a provocative statement there, but I think in a way I agree that the future of European industry will lie between a strategy that needs to focus more on smart specialization. So perhaps, yeah, the Japanese example that you mentioned is something that makes sense, and balancing between what we deem to be strategic that needs to stay in Europe, and also what we can do based on the energy means that we have, which we know are more limited compared to other regions. But with this, I wanted to move to Milan, who works at a large think tank in the US. You've worked in Europe for up until, what, a year ago or less than a year ago. So I'm curious about the perspective you come with about how Europe is seen from across the Atlantic. We've spoken about the utility of subsidies perhaps elsewhere for European consumers. Here we're sort of stuck right now in this narrative on competitiveness in which everything seems to be about spending big and building big. But how do you see this compared to what the US is doing right now? Do you see any potential cooperations going forward in a way in which Christian described earlier as well?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michna. Great pleasure to join you at your anniversary, and congrats for the organization that you have all built. So I'm at RFF, which has nothing to do with recovery and resilience funds. It's Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C., and that gives me some great opportunities to talk about EU climate policy with a lot of American stakeholders and policymakers, but also many other visitors to Washington. What you notice then is that EU climate policy is definitely respected, grudgingly so, but they take it seriously and sometimes deemed annoying, especially when there are reporting requirements that proliferate. So if you think you're annoyed by something coming out of Brussels, just imagine how a mid-sized steel company in Ohio feels like the first time they need to go to the Commission website. Nevertheless, it is the case that Californians, for example, they always want to be the best in everything, including in climate policy. So they take EU climate policy very seriously. New Yorkers then can never be soon to be doing the same thing as Californians. So they try to come up with their own system that makes it really necessary for the US federal government to also start taking these things seriously. And in very similar areas of climate policy, the energy transition, sustainable finance, you do see a lot of activity happening. That doesn't mean that the US or any other country will do the same thing as Europe. Absolutely not, because they have enough power of themselves and they will do things that fit their own countries. So CBAM is actually a very good example of how the EU is influencing the rest of the world. It is not a loved policy anywhere, but people realize that the EU is serious about it, and you now see an incredible amount of initiatives, especially in Asia, to introduce various forms of carbon pricing. These policies aren't there yet, but they are being consistently iterated, and I do think we will see some of them becoming real over the next year. Industrial policy has also made a comeback everywhere. That's not going to change. And many countries want investment and clean tech production for economic, environmental, and security reasons. And even if the motivations differ from country to country, it does lead to very comprehensive policy strategies. The EU will never really be able to do what the US did with the Inflation Reduction Act. I think everyone acknowledges that. The US has two specific properties in their system: the reserve currency, a very high willingness to take on national debt that no one else can copy. But why should the EU let American taxpayers, of which I'm now one, bear that burden? So we have contracts for differences as an alternative. Then, like, a lot of it is already taken over by the EU ETS. That's great. Should also note that if Europeans might feel uncomfortable with all of the fiscal capacity of the Inflation Reduction Act, every other country around the world has similar concerns. So that might also open the way for some type of coordination that isn't just about throwing more money at clean tech. So ultimately, the role for Europe, I think, still has to involve some component of a creative new fiscal resource or a common asset that can be used to support clean tech deployment. That is still the EU weak spot, but it should absolutely find a way to do so to support this deployment while maintaining the integrity, by which I mean convergence and cohesion as well in the EU internal market. And there's a lot of discussions on that ongoing in Brussels. Final point then is that we've heard a lot on the geopolitics of the energy transition. There's a lot of competition between the US and China. Industrial policy, I think, is not going away. Trade policy, even in this room, but I think in almost every room outside of rooms in Washington, D.C., the opinions are always a bit mixed. There is the argument that multiple people today have mentioned. China is genuinely good at creating very low-cost technology. But we also have to face the reality that there are some countries around the world who, for various motivations, will want to have instruments that are seen as distortive in the market or under WTO rules. So the EU should recognize trade-offs and make some hard choices with regard to competitiveness, trade, and financing. Very final point is that when you think about other things in the digital transition and defense, etc., there's a lot of policy innovation as well. So maybe think about the policy spillovers there too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for making this parallel to other policy fields, because sometimes we can be so inwards looking that we forget that the purpose is larger than just this. Tough choices ahead. Industrial policy is here to stay. I think us here in Romania as well still have to plan a bit about how to go about this, how we can choose those areas where we need to focus, like we were hearing a bit earlier. But at the end of the day, as you said, fiscal capacity is limited. This is not everywhere the case, but we discussed this in the past. And you mentioned now as well this sort of need to keep the balance with the cohesion goals of the EU as well. And I wanted to ask you a bit about following up on that, because right now the investment framework at the EU relies a lot on state aid, rules having been relaxed to quite an extent, and the vast majority of it going towards two member states at the moment, creating imbalances and frictions, tensions, with the cohesion architecture that we've put in place, and it has been very successful over the past few decades. So do you have any thoughts about how this can be taken further and changed in a way that is more equitable for European regions? Big question.
Huge question, and I hate having to answer that. It's a really difficult one. But let me maybe first say that we in Europe use state aid because that is where the fiscal capacity is, and that is where, in principle, clean tech and other deployment could happen, even in a better way than the US is doing. But the US, for all of its fiscal might at the moment and all of its generous tax credits, is still facing, at the very, very end, the fact that someone needs to buy the products, even if you can cover the whole product with a publicly financed business case. So on the demand side, there still are steps to be taken that will make everything, even the existing instruments in the EU, easier. I think on the internal market as such, there is at least some sacred cows, if you will, of state aid control have been breached in recent years, and the latter report suggests taking further steps in that. by, for example, having this pooled fund. And you can also imagine interactions with Stability and Growth Pact, fiscal rules. But even though it doesn't have to be hundreds of billions, some commonly allocated asset, one way or the other, remains a priority. And I hope that even if it's justified by pure domestic competitiveness reasons, Europe finds a way to do that over the next 5 years.
Great. And yeah, Christian, please.
Yeah, when you look at the regions, how they develop, there is a good empirically there's a good case. One of a big member states, a relatively big member state, all the regions fall behind. They're declining. Now, my inclination would be that's a result of the national policy, and the EU cannot fix that. And that, I think, is very important, that to understand that a lot of the solution will have to come from the member states themselves. And there is so much the EU can do, but not everything, especially if things go wrong in the domestic sphere.
Yes, indeed, you are right, and I think that this is never an excuse for the lack of national action. At the end of the day, it's national action that is causing the problems in the first place. It's not the EU, it's the relaxation of the EU's state aid, yeah? So it's the German government, it's the French government. So I would challenge you a bit that it matters not just about what each of us do individually, but also about how we integrate those measures within a common European market, because I think the last thing we want to end up with is an American-style federation in which there's a race to the bottom between states and about what they can offer the companies and the manufacturers that would move there. With that, we're moving towards the final part of the panel, and there's questions in the audience. Yes, please. Also, if any of you want to react to what the previous speakers have said, like keep that in mind, and after Mara's question.
Thank you very much. My name is Mara Balasha, and I'm a PhD fellow at Stockholm School of Economics, and I'm also associate with the Energy Policy Group. I think my question is mostly towards Christian and Milan, because when Christian mentioned that Japan example with the 18 technologies that should kind of be prioritized, I remember you two wrote a paper in 2018 where you discussed about some policies to accelerate the low carbon transition. And I was thinking of this technology choice mechanism that you mentioned there, that would be kind of a tool that the states could use to decide which technologies to prioritize and to finance. And my question basically is, do you still think we need that? And if yes, how should we design such a technology choice mechanism? Thank you.
You see, that happens if you write papers and people read them. It's what currently there is the approach under the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Material Act to look at the specific subsectors. Now, I'm discussing with a couple of people in the Commission, and the difficulty is, what are the indicators? How actually do you find them? And I don't know. I mean, the way I understand the Japanese approach, they just looked at which companies they have and where, in which segment of the market they are competitive. And that, in a way, was the identification. But, Japan is a federal country. Europe is 26, 27, whatever, or 28. And there you have to somehow go to some, seems to be a reiterative process to find this. I don't think this indicator approach will get us anywhere. But you really would need to look where are the leading companies. Now, in the discussion, and then I finish here, these companies have not been really present so much in the climate discussion, but now they are coming and they start realizing they are under pressure, and now they say, look, we are cutting edge, we are under pressure, both from the US and China, and we need you know, we need support or at least something of that kind. Now, I don't know whether this is a sufficient answer to your very good question.
Yeah, I think your question, in a way, is also about one of these buzzwords of technology neutrality, which people always support in principle, but less so in practice. In the context of climate policy, I mean, it is technology neutrality then while accepting the fact that you have high and low carbon. The reason why hydrogen perhaps is underperforming a bit relative to the extremely lofty expectations around 2018 is because you need gobsmacking amounts of clean electricity, which we don't have yet, or CCS, which only tiny volumes are available as well. So I do think if you look at what the US is doing, what Japan, even Australia has a somewhat reasonable government from a climate perspective, again, Indonesia, India as well, you do come up with a list of technologies where some make more sense if you genuinely want to reach net zero than others, and many of them have been discussed already, but something related to electricity will always be part of it.
Thanks for the question. Are there any more burning interventions from the audience? If not, then we should move towards wrapping up this panel. On paper, a simple question for everyone, but I think in practice it will be quite difficult to keep it in a couple of minutes. We've spoken a lot about Romania, about Europe, about Europe's role in the world, and the topic for this panel is what happens from 2035 onwards. So I'm going to start with you, Alexandra, about what the role of Romania you think will be in not just national but international climate policy going forward after 2035. Then I'll move to Jozsef for the region. Christian, I'll keep you still in the region, but Europe as well, and Milan about the role of Europe post-2035.
Thank you. So I think we are going to continue contributing to the reduction of emissions in the European Union. We are one of the countries that have, as has already mentioned here, substantially reduces emissions since 1990. We are planning, according to our long-term strategy, to be at around 82% reduction by 2035. So we are going to continue to support the EU leadership when it comes to climate change. But also, and this has have been conversations that took place in working groups convened by the presidential administration. These are conversations that we had with the government, the presidential administration. We also want to play a role in the economy. We do have an energy mix which is pretty decarbonized, so that means that goods and services produced in Romania will have hopefully a lower footprint, and we further plan to decarbonize our energy mix. So we think that this would make us attractive in the green transition and in the green economy. And also there have been conversations about a Romanian industrial plan, a green industrial plan. We have seen plans at the European level, programmatic documents at the European level on a Green Deal industrial plan. But now the government of Romania, with the push from the Romanian presidential administration, is working at a Romanian green industrial plan, which hopefully will be able to isolate the industrial sectors in which we have a competitive advantage, so that we contribute more to international green value chains. And also will identify what kind of incentives we can give to the industry and to investors to come and develop businesses in manufacturing, in green manufacturing in Romania. So I hope that Romania will be a contributor also to the green industry of the European Union.
All right. I think the region will have more central role in Europe because of the political gravitation of Europe is shifting. But there will be some challenges. When we look into the power sector, while I say that the transition is possible, and I think after 2035 we will have no problem in the power sector, What I'm a bit concerned about when we will have enough electricity, obviously renewable, to satisfy all the needs. And here I'm thinking also about the direct electrification of the industry and all the other uses which are increasing. So that's more of a balancing where I see the questions. But otherwise, I am not concerned about the region when it comes to power sector. The other parts of the transition might be more tricky when it connects to people, transport, and the buildings and those stuff.
I'm not sure whether we should be so concerned about the backlash. I see this as the pendulum swings back. You know, it was very much swinging to the green side, and now it swings back, and it tends to overswing. I mean, that's why a pendulum is there. We are in a phase to adjust, to put up the other pieces. And how I see the discussion going, government starting to become aware that in some technologies, there is simply little chance, the commoditized, that Europe or the US can catch up. On the other hand, we also see that there is a number of technologies which we didn't really have on the mind. For example, cloud computing. You know, if there is no European cloud, I mean, all the discussions we're leading is useless, you know, more or less, and you know, advanced microchips and you name it. So many of the tech applications will become much more in the focus, and that also will change the discussion on competitiveness, resilience, and sustainability away from the more traditional power sector issues.
Yeah, so Europe's role after 2035. If you try to defend the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism abroad, especially in developing countries, you will sometimes be accused of what about the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibilities? As in, why are you opposing something on us when we can decide our own climate ambition? But that has two sides. So the EU considers itself to have a lot of historical responsibility and therefore needs to pursue an ambitious climate policy. If it fails at that, then many countries around the world would also say, okay, well, EU couldn't do that. Why are we still bothering? And then you will be in a world with far costlier policy eventually on adaptation, climate impacts, and also unconventional mitigation that will be pursued then ultimately because the problem isn't going away. So for the time frame around 2035 then, what the EU could and should do is continue to support plurilateral, multilateral, and cooperative international approaches and institutions that help with a sensible but also strong move towards net zero. I think both European households and companies would perform much better in such a world than in a more fragmented and chaotic world.
Fantastic. I am immensely grateful for the contributions we've had and for the very good discussion. The power sector, by 2035, we should already have some clarity whether we're able to reach our targets. And it seems that this will be the easier task, perhaps, because the more difficult will be moving into literally people's households. So the heating of homes, the road transport, and helping those consumers that struggle to make the transition by themselves through targeted aid. We're also looking at not exactly to say a restructuring of our economies, and there's all these new value chains and clean technologies that Europe is looking. It's in a competition with other parts of the world. Of course, the balance will be somewhere in the middle between trying to find out what's strategic for you to do domestically, but also what partnerships you can open up with the rest of the world. And to finish on a positive note, as we've set the targets, the ambitious targets in the EU, and we have the policy toolkit for implementing it in Europe, the European Green Deal is slowly moving into a global arena. Yeah, it's becoming more about attracting other countries that need to also participate in climate change mitigation efforts, because without that, there's little use of all the fantastic efforts that we are trying to achieve here in Europe. So I would like to thank my co-panelists for this fantastic discussion. Thanks to everyone who has survived until now. I have checked, and we've gained a few more viewers online than when we started. So people online who are already eating are probably a bit more comfortable. But yeah, a quick round of applause for the panelists. Before you go, we have lunch, which is just outside. And for everyone, we'll be very happy to welcome you tonight at a reception starting at 7 o'clock here in the same room. Less serious discussions and just trying to be with friends and with people that have been alongside EPG throughout this wonderful journey of 10 years. Thank you.